Hey there, I'm Dr. Karen, and I am so excited to have you here with me today. In this session, I'm going to show you how to make your clinical expertise scalable so that you can go from being a skilled clinician to an impactful leader. So let's get started with some housekeeping things. As I said, my name is Dr. Karen Dudek-Brannan, and I wanted to share a little bit about who this session is for. So, first of all, with your housekeeping things, I recommend that you make sure that you have a good internet browser as you're watching so that you are able to get good load speed throughout this video. Obviously, it's pre-recorded. So if you have a question at any point in time, feel free to use that purple chat box at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen to send me a question, or you can email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. I do recommend using earbuds if you are watching this presentation. Occasionally, I might use some colorful language, and also it just helps for you to be fully engaged if you've got me in your ears. So let's get started with who this presentation is for. So this presentation is for you if you're at the point in your career that you've really evolved beyond those pre-made materials, the Pinterest therapy, and the flashcard drills. They're tools in your toolbox, but you're definitely not dependent on them. And the reason that that's the case is because you can take a generic worksheet or game or whatever it is and turn it into a meaningful session. And you're really good at planning on the fly, which, by the way, is not half-assing your planning. It just means that you know what you're doing. You're also probably getting some of those micro wins in your language therapy sessions, and you intuitively know how to model, scaffold, and adjust. So even though it does feel like things sometimes are kind of cobbled together and they might not have the hierarchy that you would want, you're still able to figure out how to adjust, like I said, on the fly, because you know how to do good language facilitation. You've got a lot of tools in your toolbox, and you have a lot of ideas about effective practices. You know them pretty well, and you'd love to share them with your team in your building to inform some of the practices that are going on at the curriculum level or outside your rooms. And maybe you have a few team members who regularly seek you out for advice because they've started to realize how valuable you are. But despite all of these things, you still haven't quite figured out how to define, package, and share what you're doing to support kids, even though it can feel seamless when you're doing it yourself. So you're not necessarily seeing some of those micro wins that you're seeing in your sessions generalize outside of your sessions. And you do spot problems in classrooms that you know are impacting your students, especially when it comes to addressing some of those language challenges that they might have outside of your room. But sometimes you don't know how to speak up without either overstepping or getting really excited about your suggestions and actually overwhelming teachers. So your tools are there, but they're not well organized. So your planning, even though you get it done, takes longer than it should. And then, of course, the biggest problem of all your best ideas are living in your head, which means your impact stops when your therapy sessions end. If this sounds familiar, I get it. I used to feel the same way. Like I said, my name is Dr. Karen, and I'm a speech pathologist by training. And I also have a doctorate in special education. I spent 14 years in the schools supporting students with language literacy and executive functioning needs and helping teams develop systems. And in 2015, I started an online education company where I help service-based professionals like speech pathologists and other related service providers build systems that make their therapy more impactful and their expertise scalable, specifically relating to language literacy and executive functioning. So back in the early 2000s, when I was in the schools, I knew how important language skills were to my students' success. And my team was facing a surge of referrals. It was around the time when we were trying to implement response to intervention. And my team really needed leadership in the area of language and literacy, not just with the way that I supported students in my sessions, but at the building level. And when it came to language therapy, the area my team needed me the most, I didn't have a way to organize all of the tools in my toolbox. And I used all my mental bandwidth for planning session to session 1 week at a time. And there was really no capacity left for thinking about collaboration and leadership. So that's what inspired me to really specialize in the area of language and literacy during my doctoral program, where I put together a framework that I used with my own caseload. And what happened was that I finally was able to share that framework with my team and implement it with my caseload. And what that allowed me to do was go from that person who just works on the R sound to more of a thought leader in the building who could impact the way that referrals and curriculum worked on our team. And that's what inspired me to start my company back in 2015, where I started teaching other SLPs that framework. And through all this work, I help speech pathologists and other clinicians make their expertise scalable and visible to their teams, as well as effective in their direct sessions. So let's get back to that question of why you're here. So, why does your therapy feel good but not great? Maybe it's because you know a curriculum or a systemic shift needs to happen in your building, your district, and beyond, but you don't have capacity to figure out how to make an impact beyond your sessions. And language is such a huge area. It takes so much mental bandwidth to just plan sessions. So you might feel like all your great ideas are on the tip of your tongue, but you just can't quite articulate them. The good news is that if this sounds familiar, I'm going to go through 3 mistakes that clinicians often make that results in some of these challenges and how to shift them so that instead of hitting the ceiling that you're hitting right now, you can go above and beyond. So, what I'll cover today is mistake number 1, the clinical decision bottleneck that limits generalization beyond sessions. And this is something that no one talks about. We definitely don't learn it in our pre-service training, and I rarely hear any mention of this in any type of professional development seminar that I've ever attended for speech pathologists or other clinicians. Then there's mistake number 2, what I refer to as the iteration spiral, that prevents clinicians from defining their process enough that they can efficiently repeat it. Then finally, we'll cover mistake number 3, the linchpin problem that keeps students and your team dependent on you to reinforce those language skills that you're so wonderful at reinforcing, but other people might not necessarily be the same way. One thing I wanted to remind you of is that, again, if you have any questions throughout this presentation, you can type them in that chat box. Again, it looks like this. It's purple. It's on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you're on a desktop, it might be closer to the bottom if you are on a mobile device. So let's start with mistake number 1. The clinical decision bottleneck that limits generalization beyond sessions that no one talks about. So first, let's talk about why this happens and why it's so nuanced. What are we often taught to do as clinicians when it comes to individualizing our sessions? Well, obviously, we hear things like we have to use our professional judgment. We have to make clinical decisions. And then, of course, we have to individualize. This is what we see as our role as the clinician who is creating those skilled therapy sessions and goals. Now, of course, this is a huge part of our role and is part of what we should be doing. We've got to embrace this idea of individualizing for all of the very important things it brings. So, one of the reasons why this is particularly important when it comes to language therapy is because language development is not linear throughout those school age years. Even though we might be able to consider some kind of a developmental hierarchy, we know that things like environment and exposure really impact those language skills. So it's really difficult to pinpoint what language skills are age appropriate at what time. And so that means we've got to do a lot of legwork and problem solving to try to figure out exactly the best way to serve our clients, figuring out what their needs are, figuring out what environmental demands are, and just generally how to help them be successful. There's definitely not a scripted way to do this. So that's why the idea of individualizing is good from that standpoint, particularly when it comes to language therapy. Another reason why individualizing is good, again, is because environmental exposure and expectations can impact development. One of the most common questions I get is, what words are age appropriate for what grade level? Well, you and I both know that we can't really pinpoint what words are age appropriate for grade levels because it's highly dependent on what words kids are exposed to. So again, we have to do a lot of problem solving to figure out exactly how to target things like vocabulary and consider the environment and the expectations and geography where you live in your community and all of those kinds of things. But at the same time, we can't completely abandon this idea of a developmental progression because we do know that there are certain skills that develop in a certain sequence for many kids, and then couple that with all of the different diagnoses that we serve. So, again, we've got to do a lot of clinical problem solving here when it comes to language to figure out what is the most appropriate way to facilitate these skills and what skills are important to target. And then finally, individualizing is good when you're planning your sessions and your strategy because in addition to the fact that language is incredibly complex and there's lots of language skills we could be targeting, we also have to consider our own team dynamics and building culture. Who's working on what on your team and what other resources do you have available to you when it comes to your coworkers and the makeup of your team? And how big is your caseload? What are the laws across the states and what's your bandwidth? And then what other things are impacting the ability to serve students? Things like funding, local policy, curriculum, all of these things are going to impact your strategy for language therapy. So, of course, your strategy is going to be incredibly customized to you, your students, and your unique situation. And I wanted to just ask you to reflect on something for a minute, just thinking about all the different decisions you have to make in your daily job and how you feel when you've been really grappling with something and thinking through something and you just want clarity and an answer. And people tell you that the answer is to use your best judgment. Chances are that that feels a little bit dismissive. Sometimes you just want an answer because it frees up some space for you to think about something else. Now, if you're like most clinicians who are supporting kids with language and literacy needs, you've probably worked on a lot of these skills that are on the screen right now. You might have worked on inferencing and synonyms and stating the main idea. You probably have some students who have some goals for WH questions, and maybe you've got teachers telling you that your students need to work on following directions. Even though this looks kind of messy, somehow you're able to, in your head, organize it enough to come up with a pretty good session for your students. So, what you often have to do in your head on a daily basis is take this big mess of language skills and fit them into nice, little, neat therapy activities, kind of like those little drawers on the bottom right-hand side of the screen there. That's what your brain is doing on a daily basis. So let's quantify this for a minute. Let's say that you have 60 students on your caseload, and most of those students have at least one language related goal. Now, I listed probably between 13 and 15 skills on that last screen. Let's be honest, there's probably more language skills, and let's be honest, your caseload might be bigger than 60 depending on what state you're in. So, if we multiply the number of students by the number of language skills, that's a lot of decisions. That's over 900 decisions that you would have to make when you think about the student versus the decision of, do I work on this skill with the student? Thankfully, there is a solution, which is to make what you do scalable. So, shifting from saying, how do I plan these sessions week to week, to how can I invest time in creating something now that I and others can continue to use? So, take a second and consider how you've been doing your sessions. Could you take what you're doing and easily repeat it yourself without significant ongoing effort? And could you explain what you're doing to someone without your professional credentials so that they could do it? And could your process be replicated across multiple people? If the answer is no, your process isn't scalable, at least not yet. And here's the thing that most people don't realize. The more skilled you are as a clinician, the longer you can stay in this place and sustain this clinical decision bottleneck. And that's because if you are a good, skilled clinician, your ceiling of tolerance for putting up with this is higher because you're able to pull off a pretty good therapy session even without a framework. This is Connie, and Connie actually went through my Language Therapy Advanced Foundations program where I teach my language therapy framework that I used in the schools that I developed during my doctoral program. And this is exactly what she was doing. What she said was, I always enjoyed language therapy, but I used to spend hours planning for my sessions. But once she learned the framework, that all changed. And she was able to see some quick results with her students, but most importantly, she was able to do it in much less time. When she started, she was actually spending more time planning than she was in sessions, and she was able to essentially cut that in half. Which leads me to the second mistake, which is called the iteration spiral. And this iteration spiral is what prevents clinicians from being able to define their process enough that they can repeat it. Maybe you have lots of ideas. You can even get lost in the zone when you're working. You love the creative process of thinking of different ideas when it comes to language therapy or therapy in general. And maybe when you have a new idea, you tend to get so excited about it that you overcommit to big projects. You just get sucked into them because you're so excited about it. Maybe people talk about how smart you are, but don't follow through on your suggestions, or people make comments about how smart you are because they don't understand half of what you're saying. And when you take an honest look at what your planning looks like when you're doing it in your head, and you're thinking about all these different things that you have, your system, you might have some different toys or flashcards or worksheets or apps and games, and there's lots of different things that you're using for language therapy, which is great. You should be using those things. But then you have all these other ideas. There's things that you're pulling together from what coworkers asked you to do, or initiatives in your building, or maybe things that you've collected, or maybe just the random ideas that pop into your head as you're going through the day. And even though it can feel a little messy, a lot of times it makes your brain really happy. You love this creative process. So you're passionate about what you do and kind of intense, even if you're introverted. You like to get things done and you're comfortable with aggressive timelines, but you might have moments of burnout. But then you recover quickly and continue to repeat that same pattern. So you kind of have this love-hate relationship with hard work and the hustle, where you sometimes love it, but because of the overcommitting, sometimes you think, oh crap, what did I get myself into? Now, obviously, when you're a high performer like this, there's a lot of good things about it, but there might be a lot of downsides as well. Maybe you've had some uncomfortable conversations with your significant other or your family members about how much you're working. You might overwhelm people with some of the technical explanations, like your coworkers, because those technical explanations are kind of your default setting because you know your discipline so well. But people don't always call you out on it, so you're not really sure if you're doing it. And a lot of times, the reason they don't call you out is because they might be intimidated, or maybe they don't want to hurt your feelings. And another downside is that you might, without realizing it, overcomplicate things for yourself and others. And you're constantly tweaking your process. And since there are no parameters, it rarely feels good enough to be able to share. And the challenge when you get past that Dunning-Kruger phase is that when you develop something, you know when it might need to be tweaked, and you might know ways to improve it, which of course means that it might lend towards being a perfectionist. The problem is that if there are no constraints, it can actually stifle you from moving forward and defining things enough that people can understand what you're doing. So the key to solving this problem is creating a scalable container. You create some constraints to organize those broader language areas and those isolated skills, tools, and resources that you've collected, and you establish what I refer to as containers to rein you in just enough to define your process and drive your iteration forward. So, shifting from this idea that you need to continue to add more skills, more materials, and instead, we need to create a clinical container. One of my language therapy advanced foundations students, Michaela, was able to do that when she learned my 5 component language therapy system that I teach. What she said was that language therapy advanced foundations helped her to be so much more confident, which made her job less stressful and actually made room for more passion for her job. Which leads me to the last mistake, which is the linchpin problem that keeps students and your team dependent on you to reinforce those language skills. A linchpin is a small mechanical pin that holds a wheel or some other type of structure in place. And if it's removed, the whole structure falls apart. So if you're the only one on your team who has any idea what your process is for facilitating language, then you are a linchpin, which somewhat feels good to be indispensable, but at the same time does not create a situation where generalization is likely to happen. You know that you only get 30 to 40 minutes a week with your students if you're lucky. And that's not enough time to target every single language skill needed to support the cognitive skills students need for future success, especially if you've got those students who need kind of a little bit of everything. No matter how efficient you are and good at scaffolding, you're just not going to get all of that in during the time you have with your students. And let's be honest, the system that we're working in is not going to change anytime soon. Now, usually the method of scaling that school leaders default to when it comes to thinking about, all right, how might we create something that others can reinforce? Usually, school leaders define something like curriculum standards. They think about scaling curriculum across grade levels and across buildings. Yet no standard language therapy curriculum exists because of all of those reasons we have to use our clinical judgment and individualize. You need to have a system so you can make decisions about what needs to be addressed by you, by others, and all of that is going to be highly dependent on your unique situation and caseload. You need this system so you can make sure language facilitation happens outside your sessions, but this won't happen if you essentially are the system. Now, I work from frameworks, not curriculums, because frameworks box you in just a little bit that you have some parameters, but not so much that you can't individualize. What I do is teach speech pathologists how to create a scalable container for their language therapy. The big, broader container is vocabulary. So, vocabulary is like this broad umbrella that we use to define the strategies and techniques that we're going to pull into our language therapy system. So, why is vocabulary such a powerful container to use for your language therapy? Well, without adequate word and sentence comprehension, students are unlikely to respond to higher level comprehension instruction. So that's why I often see clinicians who come into the language therapy advanced foundation program and they are working a lot on high level comprehension, but because they don't have a container for vocabulary, they haven't targeted those foundational language skills to the extent that they need. So, because word and sentence level comprehension are so important, if we don't address those underlying vocabulary issues, those comprehension challenges are likely to persist. And there's a huge body of work that supports this idea. Now, most clinicians know that vocabulary matters, but not many use it as a foundation that organizes therapy into a strategic, repeatable system, which is why many clinicians are getting good results, but not exceptional results. So, what we want to shift is going from thinking of vocabulary as just a set of skills, which of course it is, but it's also a container that allows you to highlight essentials and piece together what you're already working on, and then also eliminate what doesn't fit within that framework. I've had a handful of students, two different Jennifers that happened to go through Language Therapy Advanced Foundations and applied this framework for vocabulary. What Jennifer Smith said was that she felt competent and effective. She didn't think she could possibly love her job anymore, but once she got a better framework, those results that she was already getting amplified. And then the other Jennifer said, I know that I'm a better SLP now because of what you have given me. So the first step is to identify the big container, and then we have to identify smaller containers that fit within. And then after that, once we've defined our other areas, that's where we can start slotting in those treatment techniques to make sure that we're addressing all of the areas. And here is where we can start to organize and evaluate what you might already be doing, decide if you want to add new strategies, and so on. So those 5 areas that are going to fit under vocabulary, that are all going to support it as well as interact with each other, are phonology, orthography, morphology, semantics, and syntax. So phonology, of course, being that we need to be able to produce and recognize words when we hear them, not just from a standpoint of speech sound disorders, but also having that picture in your head of all the sounds that make up a word and the meaning that they have when you say all of those sounds in sequence, and then also being able to produce them. So phonology is both a skill that has to do with being able to pronounce the words, but also being able to recognize them. So it supports vocabulary as well. Then, of course, we have orthography. So being able to recognize and produce words in print with automaticity. So we don't often think of spelling as a skill that is within the SLP scope, but it absolutely is, because the spellings of words and the print symbols that go with them are also tied to word meanings. And then, of course, we have morphology. So these are all starting to build on each other, is that we need to develop knowledge of those linguistic units that make up words. So prefixes, bases, roots, all of those things that are going to drive meaning of words. So they're going to have those linguistic units that are going to have phonological characteristics. They're going to have semantic meanings. And then, of course, our ability to understand those and be automatic in our recognition of them is going to impact our vocabulary development as well and have a big impact on our literacy skills. Then, of course, we have semantics. So understanding word attributes and how they tie to word meanings. So having those ideas of word attributes and having strategies to build these skills is, of course, going to be very important in our understanding of vocabulary as well. And then finally, we have syntax, which initially I did not think of syntax as a vocabulary skill, but it absolutely is, because it's not just important what words mean, but also it's important what words do. Vocabulary is about both content, knowing the content, but also being able to use the content and put things together. Syntax is huge in language comprehension and supporting those high-level skills. This is Jessica, one of the Language Therapy Advanced Foundation students, and she saw a huge difference when she started to work on both syntax and semantics. And one of her struggling students finally started to become more aware of the way that he was stringing sentences together and actually start using them. Now, I imagine that you have a bunch of questions at this point, because this isn't something that we often hear about in a lot of seminars for SLPs. So the first question being, okay, I get that vocabulary is important, but how do I actually define my specific role in literacy? How do I define how this looks for me in my building with my caseload? So the first step is to learn the framework. Learn a framework for targeting those foundational language skills, which of course should center around vocabulary and those 5 components that I mentioned today. And what this is going to do for you is clear up some misconceptions surrounding comprehension. Many clinicians often think that they need to be only working on comprehension because that's what's going on in the classroom, but really they're actually working on skills that weren't working very well in the classroom. And they're just repeating what didn't work, when actually their therapy sessions need to be focusing on something different. So the way that we solve that problem is to really define those bumpers for yourself, define those containers, learn the framework, learn the essential five process, and allow yourself to iterate and come up with ideas within those parameters. Your creativity needs constraints. If you don't have any constraints placed on you, that actually creates chaos. And what that results in, of course, is you being that bottleneck and you kind of spiraling and continuing to create all kinds of tools and materials, but never getting it to the point that you have something you can share with other people. That feeling of needing to know all the answers and needing to know this perfect process is a very common linchpin tendency. The next question, since I've talked so much about sharing and training other people in what you're doing, is am I saying that direct therapy doesn't work? No, absolutely not. Your direct intervention is, of course, a very important part of what you do. Obviously, you're very skilled in that area. Your first step, of course, when you learn the Essential Five framework is to optimize your direct intervention because you can make a big impact. You already know that. You already are making a big impact with your direct intervention. But once you optimize there, and really define what you're doing there. Then you can start stacking other layers on top of what you're already doing. So this would be assets you can share, tools you develop, or using other models of service delivery models. So for example, going from delivering sessions just one-on-one or in groups, and then also using other models like getting into a classroom or doing some trainings. That clinical decision bottleneck can make sticking with one model feel very comfortable, especially if you are a good clinician. It's really easy to get stuck in this zone of competence instead of moving on to your zone of genius where you could be sharing your knowledge with other people. The next question, I know I talked a lot about really fine tuning and creating parameters and potentially eliminating things. Am I saying that you need to go and purge all of your materials? No, definitely not right away. First, what you want to do is define a framework. So really understand those components of vocabulary and how you're going to use those five areas and define some specific language therapy strategies that you can use within that framework. Then, once you do that, once you have a set of staple strategies, you can figure out where you want to put those existing tools in your toolbox. So it's kind of like you're pulling everything out and reorganizing a closet. Maybe you get some new things and then you figure out where to put them. That tendency to want to just purge everything and do a complete overhaul, that's the iteration spiral tendency. The next question that I often get is how do you determine if you are creating a framework that's aligned with your curriculum and evidence-based practice and is research informed and all of those good things. So regardless of what curriculum your district has chosen, a framework emphasizing vocabulary is going to be aligned with curriculum and research. There's so much research that supports vocabulary and metacognition and all the different things that you can pull in to a framework that's supporting those five components. And just keep in mind that aligning with curriculum does not mean that you need to be doing exactly what the teachers are doing. That's why you are a speech pathologist and they are teachers. You have different roles. What aligning with the curriculum means simply is that you increase students' access to curriculum. And that often means that your sessions might look different than what's going on in the classroom in order for you to build those skills that they need in order to better access and participate in the curriculum. Learning to scale will actually also position you to impact the curriculum as well. So not only will it make your direct sessions more effective, but it will also help you build the skills that you will know how to strategically impact the curriculum. And then finally, a very common question that I get from my many overachievers that I work with is what about goals, evaluations, and data? You do not have to rework all of your goals or IEPs just because you're creating a new framework or you're doing something different in your therapy or coming up with a new set of strategies. Goals are the destination, not the vehicle. So the strategies and the framework are the vehicle. You can actually keep the goals that you have The same for students, even if maybe you realize you might need to do more semantic study instead of working on some of those higher level comprehension goals. But you still probably also want your students' comprehension to improve. So just because you're working on some foundational skills that are going to get you to that end destination doesn't mean you need to do a complete overhaul right away. Your overachieving brain is going to want to do that overhaul and just revamp everything at once, but you do not have to rewrite all of your IEPs. Resist the urge to do that. Again, that's another example of the iteration spiral. Just let your brain process and add one component at a time. That's actually what I recommend for people, is that they get familiar with one of those five areas at a time and use a new strategy and iterate a little bit on it and then move on to the next one. Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but there are a lot of things that need to go on under the hood that actually result in students having good language skills. So, being able to be successful in math and comprehension and literacy and relationships and expression. Well, there's a lot of things that need to happen within your language therapy framework in order to make that happen. And I've listed some of the things that I use within my language therapy framework that I teach SLPs that focuses on those five components that actually support those higher level skills that people often see when language therapy is actually working. So, things like having an overall success path and a strategy for how you're going to sequence all of those language skills and all of those language strategies that you're going to target that are going to hit all five of those components, but also there are tools for isolated definition syntax, semantic feature study, and doing that in conjunction with definition syntax, studying semantic features and pulling in metacognition. So we're emphasizing high level processing and executive functioning and self questioning and self talk, as well as identifying the high priority syntactic skills that we want to target. Then, of course, we want to make sure that we're embedding phonology in multiple places. So, both embedded into semantic study as well as embedding phonology into word study that also emphasizes morphology and orthography. And then, of course, as we do all of these things, as we're studying words with a semantic emphasis or an orthographic emphasis, we also want to make sure that we're considering how this impacts our goals, data, and evaluations. So these are all things that I show SLPs how to do when they develop their five component framework. And this is essentially what helps them to create that scalable system that's detailed enough that it allows them to be rigorous, but is simple enough that they are able to scale it. I've actually had a handful of the SLPs who have applied this framework on my podcast. There's Amy, who was able to use the framework with her own caseload in her private practice and also was able to share it with teachers and do some classroom-based instruction. There's Katie, who was able to get some great results when she studied syntax with her students. And then there's also Tiffany, who was able to apply this at the high school level. And she actually used it to help one of her students pass the driver's test. There's a lot of complex syntax on that test. So all these skills that you can use are going to give your students the skills that they need to succeed in both school and in life. Now, I wanted to officially invite you to join Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, which is where I teach SLPs how to deliver this scalable framework. Language Therapy Advanced Foundations is my program that helps SLPs create a language therapy system they can implement across grade levels, they can use to guide therapy planning, they can use to support their teams, and also to help them advocate for effective services. The first thing that I do in the program is provide the scaling module for you. In this module, I show you the 3 steps to scaling your clinical expertise without sacrificing quality. I show you how to clarify your personal system so you can delegate, collaborate, and lead. And I will show you how to move from being a great technician to that systems level leader in your current role. You don't have to be an administrator to do this. However, if you aspire to be an administrator, it is certainly a great skill set to learn right now. Then I follow it up with the Success Path module. In this module, I show you how to identify high impact activities that target foundational language skills, how to differentiate your expertise from other professionals and add more value through strategic language intervention. And I show you my meta approach for helping your students be independent learners, both during and after their sessions with you. Next, there's the Semantics and Definitions module, where you'll learn a simple and effective method for improving word recognition and retrieval skills, where you'll learn how to get students excited about learning words and facilitate independent word learning. And you'll also learn how to help students problem solve when they come across difficult words instead of relying on you for prompting them. You'll also get a specific module on syntax, where you'll learn how to help your students focus on the most important parts of definitions so they retain word meanings, provide rich descriptions of words by organizing semantic information, and train students to define words using definition syntax so they can more effectively demonstrate what they know. In addition to the sentence structure syntax module, I also have a module that will help you select syntactic intervention strategies that are most likely to result in transfer across settings. So I'll show you how to address it in both your direct intervention, so that can be very focused. And then I also help you to center sentence level work around 4 syntactic skills that will build the foundation for strong language processing. And I even give you a plan that you can implement with 40 minutes a week of direct intervention. So I'm helping you address your sessions as well as create strategies that will eventually be able to be scaled and shared with others. Then we have the word study module, where you'll learn common mistakes teams make when it comes to spelling instruction and what to do instead, how to increase automaticity with spelling and decoding by studying word parts, and you'll also learn how to build grammar and spelling skills by integrating phonological, orthographic, and morphological awareness into your sessions. We tie it all together with the generalization module, where you'll learn why kids struggle with WH questions. You'll build listening skills by integrating semantic and morphological skills, and you'll transition from word and sentence level instruction to comprehension strategies that facilitate skill transfer. So here's where you really tie all of those foundational skills together for your students so that you can also focus on those inferencing and problem solving skills. In addition to these modules that walk you through the system, I also give you some bonuses so that you have just enough tools to really tie all of this together and organize you. One of them being the SPOT Framework Guide, which gives you a set of curriculum guides for learning academic standards and communicating with teachers, as well as collecting and summarizing data, as well as a guide to writing goals and evaluations and an IEP goal bank to streamline your goal writing. You'll also get the ultimate syntax protocols, which include over 300 worksheets. So I'm not against worksheets. I'm only against worksheets that don't have a strategy behind them. So the worksheets that I provide for this syntax guide will help you to build the comprehension skills your students need to understand text language and have that effective comprehension and expression, and it will show you how to prioritize the most important syntactic skills that are going to drive that forward. Then, of course, we have the morphology and word study toolkit, which is going to help you build those morphological, orthographic, and phonological skills that are going to boost vocabulary skills and to help your students to build those strong reading and spelling skills. And then, of course, we have the semantics and definition strategies, which will give you protocols that are going to boost word retrieval and your students' ability to learn and retain new vocabulary. And all of these tools are described in the modules as well. So you're getting these tools that are going to help streamline things for you, but I also explain how to use them in the modules. Next, we have the WH questions guide, which is going to help you to be more strategic when you focus on WH questions. A lot of times people work on these in a very isolated way, so I teach you how to be strategic and contextualized. so that you can actually improve carryover on those high-level comprehension tasks and pull in an emphasis on vocabulary as you're working on these WH questions. And then finally, we have the members Q&A area. There is both a Facebook group and then also comment sections within the members area as well, where you can leave me a comment and a question if you have a question about implementation. I also have some past Q&A session recordings that I periodically create for members where people submit questions to me and I answer questions about complex cases. I do this asynchronous format because people are in all kinds of different time zones. People are very busy. So I give you the ability to get support asynchronously so you can do it when it's convenient for you, whether you prefer submitting a question or whether you prefer going back and forth in the comments with me. So if I sold all of this separately on my website, it would be over $6,000. That's obviously not what I'm going to charge you today for Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. So I could have created a resource that offered more lesson plans or just create a traditional professional development seminar, which a lot of times those options involve bombarding you with tons of materials or just overcomplicating things. But instead, what I wanted to do was really define those bumpers and deliver all of this information in one concise container with only the materials you need and do it in a way that allows you to consume the information when it's convenient for you. So there's no intricate scheduling required to learn the process. So that's why you can join Language Therapy Advanced Foundations today for either 3 payments of $197 or you can pay in full for $497. And as a special bonus for attending the session today, if you join me this week, I'll also add the Founding Members Master Calls bonus, which are recorded Q&A sessions with the founding members where we go into challenging case studies. A lot of people find discussions about past case studies really beneficial, so I wanted to offer you the recordings of those calls. So that's available to you if you decide to join me in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations this week. You do get lifetime access to all program features. So as soon as you register and either make the pay in full option or pay the first payment of the 3-pay option, you get access to all of the program features. So you'll get your login and you'll be able to start watching the trainings right away. They're all on demand. And then you'll also be able to get access to all of the bonuses and resources that I mentioned today, as well as the area where you can ask me questions. It is delivered in an online portal where you can just log in and watch it whenever you want and rewatch it as many times as you need. Now, obviously, a lot of other programs available for clinicians focus a lot on the lesson plans, which of course, I give you lesson plans and protocols, but no one else shows you this concept of scaling from the start. So now you have several choices. You can keep being that bottleneck. You can continue to be the linchpin in that iteration spiral and essentially hoard your expertise in your brain. Or you can create a scalable system that elevates your expertise beyond your sessions and puts you in a position to make a tremendous impact. So you can start seeing that generalization you know your students are capable of. Like I said before, you can get the Founding Members Masters Calls bonus when you join this week. And you can join me in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations for 3 payments of $197 or 1 payment of $497. All you need to do is just scroll down this page and you'll be able to see the full program breakdown, the explanation of the vocabulary framework, as well as the frequently asked questions section. If you have any questions for me, please use that chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. It's that little purple chat icon. And you can also email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. Thank you so much for joining me for this session. I hope to see you in the members area.